Welcome and thanks everyone for joining us today for our NSB Engage Unlock Possibility series. While we're having more people signing in, here's a few programming notes for you. We have about a half an hour together today in this Zoom webinar, and we welcome your engagement in the program. Feel free to ask your questions anytime using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll discuss those with our speaker at the end of the talk. Also, feel free to say hello now in the chat. Tell us where you're signing in from and throughout the session with what's resonating with you. If you choose all attendees, you'll be part of the full program of discussion. As a bonus for today's session, we're really conscious about how stressful the role of an event and meeting planner can be, and we wanted to contribute more to your well-being with two bonuses from today. We'll be doing a book draw at the end of the session for one of our speakers' books. And after the official half-hour mark, we'll extend the session for about 10-15 minutes for those who want to stay with us and talk about this topic as it relates to meeting and event planners specifically, perhaps versus the industry that you're in. It is really good to have some returning visitors with us and new attendees. Thank you. As we action towards truth and reconciliation, we've also included a step of viewing our webinar through an Indigenous lens. And with this content, we took a look at the First Nations mental wellness framework, which explains that wellness is strengthened when we have purpose, hope, a sense of belonging, and meaning in our lives. And Indigenous teachings view individuals as part of the larger whole, including community and spirituality. We hope this event gives you a sense of belonging within this community. For those who don't know, I'm Teresa Bean-Ken, CEO, National Speakers Bureau Canada and Global Speakers Agency. We're one of the original speakers bureaus in North America, celebrating 50 years of service. We envision that the sharing of ideas inspires action to make the world a better place through bringing you expert speakers and thought leaders for your conferences, training programs, and events. NSB has the key. We help you unlock possibility in your personal and professional lives and for your teams. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. I first met Jennifer Moss when she was named Innovator of the Year by Canadian Business Magazine, and her work was the inspiration for a huge gratitude wall in our office. She specializes in future-focused leadership development, expertly balancing employee well-being with performance, using data-driven leadership strategies. Jen is the author of two books, including Unlocking Happiness at Work, and Harvard Business Review took notice and published her second book, The Burnout Epidemic, which became one of the 10 best new management books for 2022 by Thinkers 50. You're getting sneak peek at her latest research and the insights for her new presentations for 2024 on leadership traits for the new era, and her book, Why Are We Here? Welcome, Jen.
It's so great to be with all of you and you in particular, Teresa. I've been so lucky and fortunate to have been working with you for, it's going to be going on a decade here soon in the next year or two. So this has been just such a wonderful and fruitful relationship. And so I'm grateful for you. I'm giving my gratitude to you today. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can take a look at some of the topics. I always love visuals. We're going to talk about why are we here, which sounds, like I said to Teresa, this is pretty ambiguous title for my next book. And I think it's also, a sense of optimism and hope. And I want people to think about it in that way, because we are in a time of polycrisis where we need to have more hope, more optimism, and feel like as leaders that we can be transformational and that this is an opportunity, even though we've gone through some pretty difficult stuff in the last, few years. My journey as an author, I'll just briefly describe that. It started out with Unlocking Happiness at Work. I'd written an article for Harvard Business Review that was happiness is not the absence of negative feelings. That went viral. People really latched onto that idea because we were sort of in the midst of toxic positivity, and people wanted to, understand that their feelings were real, even if it was unhappy, and that unhappiness, can lead to happiness if we target it in the right way. And so that was really around happy employees and individuals. And I was speaking to that group. And then with the burnout epidemic, what I recognize is that we can't be happy unless we solve for those root causes of chronic stress and burnout. I'd been writing this for a while. pandemic, I would have never expected that burnout would have exploded in such a way. And then this new book is really around this high performance of individuals and teams and leaders after we've gone through this really paradigm shifting moment in our lives. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about today, just what's happened around this intense change and how it's changed us, how we as leaders need to identify with that, how we need to communicate that with our team and have a better understanding. We have to lead boldly in this upside down world, and none of us have a frame of reference. People have changed. When you look at this slide here, and it's really intended to just give you a sense of how fast and rapid that change was. We still have behavioral traits that have lasted from the days of the savannah, where we still have threat responses like we would if we were facing a saber-toothed tiger. So our brains don't shift that quickly. And we had, again, this rapid evolution of working remotely, juggling parenting and homeschooling kids. We had more meetings every single day. Overwork increased dramatically. Telemedicine and adoption of the way that we purchased our products dramatically changed in a very short period of time. What happened is our workload exploded because we went into this vacuum of time where we thought the pandemic was going to be acute. And then 2 months in, we realized, okay, we're only going to be able to bake bread for so long and Marie Kondo our kitchen or learn a new language on Duolingo. It was time for us to get back to work. And the pandemic was still there. So we had to catch up, and we've been catching up ever since. When you look at our productivity and how much it's increased, 430% more productivity and more output we're giving. And yet, we're still continuing to work more hours. When you look at the amount of hours that we work at 55 hours, it becomes actually a deficit to our ability to achieve our goals, and we're more likely to get sick. We added more hours to the workday. We added more hours to women's workday substantially. It went from about 4 hours extra on average per week to 15 hours in over just a couple of months. So I say, instead of us being in the future of work, we're actually in the metaverse of work. We're jumping the timeline. And so all of us would have never actually been in this place at this moment if we hadn't gone through this cataclysmic event. And so it's changed the trajectory. It's moved us into a new world. We have behavioral shifts, and this is really important to the book that I identify sort of in that first introductory chapter. Is we have 4 behavioral sciences, researched changes in who we are as individuals. We faced our collective mortality, and that was happening at a dramatic and scaled rate for an enduring period of time. And, you can go through that kind of death anxiety that is described in the research for an acute period of time, and it doesn't change you. But if you're consistently facing that, then it does change you. It either makes you more inward, bias confirming. So you imagine that with your employees in the workplace, they're trying to get more connected to the people that are going to confirm their way of feeling, and they're going to be more resistant to change. They're going to be more unlikely to accept our initiatives to focus on belonging, or DIA, like I mentioned, coming up in this talk and within the book. We're also seeing this continuing polycrisis, which is an economic description of this factor of multiple crises happening at the same time. So leaders, we all want to put the pandemic in the rear view. We want to move on. And yet we can't if we have these other types of anxieties still facing us: climate anxiety, multiple wars. We have instability and procurement and other things that are happening across our global marketplace. That's going to be persistent. So we're going to still have employees feeling persistently uncertain. Then there's a frame of reference piece. We can't go back to not knowing what it was like not to commute, not to have that flexibility. We can't expect employees to just jump on board when they know the difference. We didn't know that then, now we know, and that's going to impact how we lead. And then finally, that generational gap, really, really significant when you look at the amount of boomers that are leaving and our mature workers leaving and Gen Zs coming in, which is changing the dynamic of work. In the book and in the talk, I really talk about the power of purpose, which is really interesting that Teresa was talking about some of these factors. And, when we look at Indigenous culture and what really matters, mutualism is a really big part of the core philosophy that we see in Indigenous cultures. And we see this in what is needed to bring back into our workforces, like purpose and meaning and feeling like there's a reason to show up to work every day. We have a lot of what's the pointism? Why am I here? People quietly quitting. What is the point of my job? I don't feel like there's any progress. I don't see myself moving up within this organization. For women, I don't see myself modeled as leaders because our executive pipeline is narrowing. So we need to create purpose. We need to see this passion brought back to a large group of us that are not feeling engaged. The future of work, what does that look like when it comes to well-being and wellness? New research just came out that showed that the programs that we've been utilizing, that the spend of $5.6 trillion on wellness programs is not actually functioning in the way that it is. So what does that future of work look like if we look at that through an analysis of well-being and performance and happiness? The friendship recession, we're in a global friendship recession, is what John Clifton from CEO has shared with me. And I share his insights as well in the book and in the talk. That generational conflict, we're seeing a high number of people within Canada and the US early retiring. They're not staying for that retirement, or they're not even staying past retirement. They're ready to go. And then how does Gen Z fit in? Everything's changing. Flexibility is a right, not a perk. What is that going to mean for the long-term, expectations that we're going to see with this generation, and how is that going to shape the world of work? I'm going to talk about why DEI is failing. What are we getting wrong? And a lot of it is just going to the root cause of lack of belonging, and how can we foster that? Why work isn't working for women, how we can regain that pipeline of talent, talking about that broken rung and the great breakup, this breakup with women and work, and how we can salvage this incredibly talented workforce. And then I'm going to tell you that hope is a strategy. And there's a lot of exciting new research on how we can actually build pathways and goals, which is the strategy to building more hopeful employees and a hopeful workforce. One of the things that I talk about when it comes to hope is, how do we stop this above and beyond problem? One of the ways we tackle that is by being explicit. We used to just suggest that in this nebulous way that people figure out what it looks like to work above and beyond. We don't really give rules or boundaries around that. But people, when they're feeling uncertain, and you see this in the research around people facing their mortality, that death anxiety, the more they want patterns, the more they want sort of the ability to have agency and the ability to be autonomous, but also be able to feel like they're working within an infrastructure that gives them goals, that they're meeting goals, that there's a continuous feedback loop. And there's a way to tactically do that, which we need to be able to implement for people to feel more certain. And then we also reduce this need for people to kind of battle it out and compete for top spot. And that is a real issue when we're looking at developing our diversity inside of our workplaces. That doesn't work for a lot of vulnerable groups. Hope is a strategy, like I mentioned. When we look at hope, we have to look at it through the lens of research by Dr. Snyder. And what he has looked at is this idea of hope as having a plan B and a plan C. And nobody has written it better than Adam Grant and Sheryl Sandberg in their book, Plan B. But it really is broken out in this tactical way inside of the book and in the talk, how we can build that through these examples of reskilling and upskilling, how we can think about hope as a strategy in that space. When you look at continuous feedback, how do we create a model for a generation of workers that expect faster feedback when we are actually, as middle managers and as executives and directors, finding that we're time crunched even more than ever? So how do we deliver on that? There's lots of mechanisms and tactics that I explain in the talk that can give us the ability to set that up so that we still have our time back. And then the people that are needing more continuous feedback and those who don't, we can figure out a plan for those people. We want to embrace autonomy and agency, which is a buffer to burnout. How do we give people the way to job craft and create their own path to success? We want to combat change fatigue. I think a lot of us can agree that we're feeling this level of exhaustion from more change. And yet we are going to be changing at a rapid pace for the next, I'm not even sure as a futurist when that's going to end. But when we see the adoption of AI, when we see these changes in the way that our global economy is working, how we are so interconnected across our global marketplace, how is that going to make it so that we can be able to change and make our employees and help them to be ready to change? And even as us as individuals, how can we continue to be nimble and agile when we are constantly faced with this chronic level of change? We can celebrate when we fail. That's one of the ways that we need to be able to overcome all of these stresses and uncertainty, is being ready for failure. How do we celebrate when we deviate? That's an important, again, tactical part that we'll want to share and discuss with the people within our organizations to make them successful. I hear this a lot. I mean, this whole idea of hybrid, remote, in person, what is the best? I get asked this from the executives that I work with all the time, because we don't really know. Should I make sure that we're all in the same space at the same time? Should flexibility mean that we come in at different times? What is the perfect answer to this? And what I keep telling people is there are some really good best practices that we've now discovered. I had the most amazing experience talking with Nick Bloom, who has studied this idea of remote work and hybrid work for a long time for Stanford. And we have some best practices. And yet we have to recognize that we don't really know what we're doing yet. And I keep saying that we have only had a couple of years to figure out what this new experience of work is like. So this idea that, okay, we can have a model and that's the model that's going to work and it's not going to be changed, that is not what is the reality of a high changing environment and work. So when we look at this around just in general, we are meeting and over collaborating too much. And we pulled a lot of things from the pandemic that we think we should still be doing. And yet we need to take a pause and reassess. Where are we now? We've jumped the timeline. What does the new timeline of work look like? It shouldn't mean that we've increased our Teams meeting. This is just Teams meetings. You have to imagine that this is not Zoom. This is not, any other, this is not WebEx. This is Teams meetings alone. We have increased our Teams meetings by 252% in the last year. That's too much. We're sending 40.6 billion more emails. I mean, there was already too many more emails being sent out beforehand. More docs are being shared. We're overlooping. So we need to deal with that meeting fatigue. We're constantly in this state of, everything's important. We all have to meet. And then we have to have pre-meetings for those meetings. And one of the jokes that I have, and I'm sure you're familiar with The Office. It's a great show if you haven't seen it. But there's an episode with Steve Carell where he's being told to veer right. He's listening to his GPS and his GPS says veer right, but veering right means going right into the lake. Well, because technology is in so much control over us, he just drives right into the lake. And I feel like that's what we're doing with our meetings. We're being told you have to meet for an hour. And even when we finish 30 minutes early, we still fill up that time. We need to get that etiquette back. We're respecting people's times, because right now there's a lack of respect for people's time. Laura Gersh, who's from the London School of Economics, she talks about this time theft. And we think about time theft in different ways, but she refers to this in just the time we're stealing from other people. We're spending, as you can see, just a huge amount of time on Zoom and meetings, and they're always running over. So here is one of the tactics I share on how to shorten meetings, other than planking. I mean, that's probably a good way to shorten a meeting, but maybe we should start thinking with more etiquette around, is this meeting even necessary? Who needs to attend? Maybe Jane from accounting can come in from 12:30 to 12:15. That's all she really needs to be there for. We can have asynchronous meetings, kind of like maybe what you're doing right now, watching a video later on and catching up on this presentation, which people that aren't on here might be doing, and then having people be able to fit it into their time, making those meetings shorter, setting a strict agenda and following it, asking how long should it really take and what's the mode? Can we walk and talk? Can we do something else that's different? And we also need to get better at, if someone tells us that they are, invited to a meeting or not invited to a meeting, and you either feel elated that you've been invited or feel like, oh, was that a slight? Does that mean I'm not a contributor? We need to remember that this is not that we're not being included in Becky's grade 8 birthday party. It's a meeting, and it's okay if we're not invited. We should be very grateful to people that don't invite us to meetings and start creating that scenario where we are finding time to get our time back. Because if we don't have time, we don't have space for well-being. We don't have space for self-care. We don't have space to optimize. We can't get to our goals. We need to look at this time that we're getting back and instead foster relationships with the people in our workplace. We are in a dramatic friendship recession. And what I mentioned with John Clifton, he has some data on that, which I'll share in a moment. But when you look at having really close friends at work, there's huge impacts to our productivity, to our well-being. So when we're wasting all these times in places that are just creating inefficiencies, we don't actually get to be more productive. It becomes counterintuitive. This friendship recession, like I mentioned, is pretty dramatic. Only 1 in 3 people have a best friend at work. And, if all of you can just think for a minute of what your best friend does for you in your experience of work, it's significant. They can be your ally. They can be someone that helps you stay, in a good mood when you're feeling really low. They're the ones that you can, go to as a sounding board. They just make you laugh sometimes. We need that relationship, and we also need it to be more productive and engaged. It's really critical when I talk about burnout. When we have a best friend at work, it reduces our burnout by 41%, which is a pretty, important stat. And it also helps us to just be in general happier in our real lives. So 1 in 5 say they have no one to turn to. Loneliness in men has doubled between 2022 and 23. This is obviously a significant number, which we're seeing, across the board. One of the things that we need to do to deal with this friendship recession is, I say, schedule serendipity, which seems like an oxymoron, but we want to actually find time to engage in what I call recess. What I feel like we are right now is in school without art, gym, or recess. We are recess deprived, and school and work without any of that play can just be no fun at all. And I hear people saying they're kind of missing those moments where they have the birthday cake in the lunchroom, which used to be eye rolling. Now they say they kind of miss it because we haven't got that back. We haven't got that opportunity to just have lunch together, because so often we're going into the office and we're having Zoom meetings side by side with the same people that could be in a room together. We're opting out of having those chances of connecting. We need to manage misinformation. When we have negative gossip being spread around organizations, or we feel uncertainty or fear, or we're feeling that anxiety that we feel around after going through, our mortality facing moments, or at polycrisis and continuing to make us feel stressed out, we tend to want to, get people on side. And it's really toxic inside of organizations. Instead, we need to spread positive gossip, which means talking behind people's back in a good way and being hopeful that it gets back to them. But if not, there's this really cool thing that happens inside of organizations that spread positive gossip. People actually perceive that they're going to be spoken well of as well behind their back. So they feel more likely to make friends with other people. It's really interesting when you look into this, behavioral sciences research. I say we have to have a nothing meeting. We need to have guiding questions, because the nothing meeting doesn't work. It needs to be consistent and frequent. We don't build trust in a month of trying something and then abandoning because it doesn't work. We need to look at this as a goal of putting this weekly meeting in for a year and seeing what happens. We need to ask, how are you? What was the high this week? What was the low this week? It's simple. People will tell you what lights them up. They'll also tell you what stresses them out. And then managers get this opportunity to come into those moments and be able to provide guidance when it's needed. Someone's saying they haven't slept week after week. Well, you can be a mental health conduit and provide resources for that person around some of the programs that are available. And then what can we do to make next week easier? I want to share this quick story with you about empathy. This woman, climate scientist, high, performing in her field. She has her PhD. She looks like she's got everything kind of sorted out, which is what we look like in our frames. I mean, here you see what I have behind me, but this is the reality of our lives right now. We talk about our lives in this picture perfect frame, and yet most of what's happening behind the scenes is kind of a bit of a crap show. And so we need to be able to tell people that this is what's going on in our lives, but we feel afraid. We say we're fine on average 14 times a week and only mean it 19% of the time. And yet, when we don't have care in our organizations, people leave. When we're not leaders that express empathy, we have people quitting the global workforce. 41% of the global workforce quit in 21 and 2022. And the number one reason was lack of empathy from my employer, because it increases loyalty, because it increases productivity. And I'm going to kind of, again, this maybe is my most important takeaway that I'm going to share with you and remind you is that we have stopped laughing. We have just ignored the levity. I don't know why, but we feel like we can't have fun at work again. Maybe it's that idea of, work being like going to school without art, gym, or recess. But this is an example of how we handle the pandemic and what we can realize that we have developed as a cognitive skill going forward. We learned how to handle difficult situations. This is a woman who was leading her team. She turned herself into a potato. She didn't know how to turn herself off of being a potato. So she just said, we're going to do this meeting, guys. 45 minutes in, you can tell that her staff is finding it difficult to concentrate on her leading as a potato. And she became virally known as the potato boss. And I use this example because I want to remind everyone that two things can be true at the same time. We can have hard things happen, but we can also have joy and have positive things come out of that. Resiliency isn't about rose-colored glasses. It's not about ignoring the painful truth. It's about taking away what we can from it, leading with that to be transformational, to be leaders that understand that we are in an upside down world and that we can help our employees still rediscover that happiness that they're missing at work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jen. You walked us through some inspiring ideas and fun ideas. People are getting a kick out of the potato box stories. Thank you for giving us that bit of levity, especially during stressful times. You kind of need some of that. And I've picked up on your messaging about the power of increased connection within organizations, having caring organizations, as well as personal agency for our own well-being. And those three guiding questions, I think, are really helpful. So thank you for that. Speaking of questions, I will check here in the chat to see, feel free to add your questions as they come up. There was a question that to get answered as part of the discussion. You had referenced early on DEI and the A felt newer to some of the members on the call here. So maybe you can talk that through just a little bit.
Sure. The A is accessibility. And so, we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, but the A gets left off often. And even in the book, I reference that because we're not necessarily sure how to bring that into the fold. We kind of bundle it in. But more people and researchers are saying we need to create a separate space for that, to understand that the things that we might think are working for certain groups, if we're not thinking it through from an accessibility standpoint, and that's even just accessing resources and tools. It's both working with diverse groups when you talk about those who are requiring certain supports around people with disabilities at work, but it's also, if you are a person that works shift work and all of the programming is only available in a time where you can't access it, we need to be looking at those initiatives as being accessible to all. And so it plays sort of two parts in that DEIA strategy that I think we need to start thinking about more closely.
Thank you for that. And there's a question about, again, the nothing meetings, and wondering about, Tara's wondering about, can you go over the nothing meetings again and some more examples of what those can look like? And I know that related to questions, and maybe there's also other language that leaders can use to help.
Yeah, so I have a really great story that I think can share the insight around this nothing meeting. I was working with an organization that you're probably all familiar with, Molson Coors. They were in a rapid growth mode for some reason in the pandemic. I think we all maybe know why Molson Coors was doing really well inside of the pandemic. And so there was a lot of burnout. I was doing this talk, exhausted leaders leading exhausted teams, because I think we still feel that way. And we introduced the nothing meeting, and they started to work on that. And I was able to stay close with the leader of that group who said they instituted it. And he was leading a large like a large group of various teams across North America. And one of his counterparts in the US sent him a note saying that after 8 weeks, he'd been doing this nothing meeting, which is, you're asking people, how are they? They're going to lie and say they're fine when they're not. So we have to have structure. We say, what lit you up? What stressed you out? And so, people were saying what lit them up, which he said was feeling really great because he was learning, okay, Joe loves to play soccer with his kids. And I know now that, Jane and Joe really like movies. And so they started having these ad hoc lunches and talking about it. So there was that benefit. But then they started to talk about what stressed them out. And there was one woman on their team who had said that she was not sleeping. And I mentioned the not sleep piece. So it had been maybe 7-8 weeks where she was saying this, and he started to feel like, okay, I need to address this. I mean, she's just saying she's not sleeping. And so I say, don't be a mental health professional, or say you're not a mental health professional as a manager, but I'm a mental health conduit. He went and researched a whole bunch of stuff around what could we do, offer as programs around sleep, and then brought it to her in that next nothing meeting. And she told him through tears, she just started to break down and cry and said, you know what? I'm not sleeping because 3 months ago, I found out that one of my children, and along with another child that had been dealing with health issues, was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And so I really am grateful that you went to all this trouble to listen and hear and be actively empathetic, because I didn't feel like I could talk about it. And now I feel like I can. And so these nothing meetings, and I put them in parenthesis, they just create a conduit for conversation. They just open up channels for you to be able to meet people where they're at, to actively listen to what people's needs are. And then you never know what you're going to discover. And it changed this woman's experience of work. They were able to give her time, and the whole team was there to rally around her. And he said it was game changing for them as a team. And so I keep that story very close because I think, if we think about it in that way, as it not having to be anything but learning, and connecting that learning to what is available inside of our organizations, we become way better managers.
Thank you. Thank you. That really helps. And I like that phrasing about being a conduit. You don't have to have all the answers, but if you can be the conduit and a source and listen, wow, that can really make a difference. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to our audience for your questions. We're going to wrap up the formal half hour of this session with a book draw that I promised. So I will share my screen and we'll do the draw here. Here we go. Sharing the screen. Hopefully you can see. Yes, you can see the wheel.
I love that. That's great.
This is everyone who's registered in the session. Rachel C, congratulations. We will get your mailing address and send you a copy of one of Jen's books for joining us today. Thank you so much. And to everyone, I hope you found this session valuable. I'm seeing some of the comments and others interested in your work, Jen. We will have a recording of the session we'll send out afterwards, as well as some great resources that Jen has provided to help you and your organizations unlock possibility and happiness at work. Thanks again for joining. We'll leave the comments box open for a bit. Oh, I see them all coming in. Very helpful, wonderful session. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Jen. And as mentioned, we'll stay on for another 10 minutes or so. If anyone wants to stay and ask questions specifically about how this connects to some of the stresses and well-being of being an event planner specifically. And you can ask questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom, or if you want to raise your hand, Michelle, who's helping to produce this on our team, will open up the sound so that you can ask a question to Jen directly. So feel free to bring those on. And Jen, if you have any context that you want to share from what you've seen in the events industry, that might be a great way to start it off.
Yes, I have the joy. I always love talking to the folks that are in the mode when we're on site, and it's obviously very intense on site, and so that's a big factor. And I know that it's a different kind of mindset and role that you're in when you're in the moment. But I've had lots of conversations with some of the frustrations that happen kind of when you go back, and I get questions around just family management and going back home and going back to work, and how if you're in a traveling role, that can be a difficult part of your burnout to manage that. How do you, if you, for example, I travel a lot, and I have children at home. And when I get back home, I always feel like, oh, I need to be extra on if I've been away. I also feel like when at work, you've been away, you get to, you tend to have a lot of meetings that all show up on the first day that you get back. People want to fill in your calendar immediately. And so one of the ways that I've tried to suggest to those in the event planning world is, how do you create space for you to be able to come down off of something that you might have been working on for months, and then you're in the stretch, and then you come back and you're extremely exhausted. And we don't see that as restful time. We usually want to go right back to debriefing and postmortems and, go into the next mode or the next planning session. And I think what is so critical, we need productive rest, and we need to call it productive rest. We call it breaks or taking a break or taking time off. What we need to look at that, instead, is that space to be able to still hit our goals, to still be able to come back in a way that's refreshed, to be able to be high performing, because we also see in this sector, in this group, high performing perfectionists, type A personalities that are a very high risk of burnout. And if we stop feeling guilty and look at this as productive time for us to regroup, I think we'll be better at being able to revitalize and ask people around us and feel like we have permission to get the space to recover.
Thank you. Yeah, the rest is just as important as the quote unquote productivity in order to be able to do the work. You need the productive rest to do the work. Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in a question here related to sectors across the board. There's a question from Cheryl wondering about, is your research consistent and applicable across sectors? Have you found it relates to education, whether it's teachers, administrators, students?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I actually spent quite a bit of my time when we were running a startup called Plasticity Labs, a huge amount of effort. We actually did a 4-year study in elementary and post-secondary. We looked across how we can apply these types of strategies to increase student success. We found, obviously, in our control groups, those that did not have that type of support and dealing with burnout, dealing with stress as faculty, but also in administration, that we saw that there was a relationship with students that were suffering. But at the same time, there was a shared language that we needed to have across the board, because often, when we look at student success, there's this separation between what matters for the students doesn't matter for us, as individuals, and for those that are teaching, and the people that are around that are supporting it. And so that's moved into a lot of work that I've done within, post-secondary institutions. I do a lot of talks within associations, within education. And so that's specific to that group. But this message goes across all sectors. I have, spoken in healthcare, finance, technology, Fortune 100, Google's and, IBM's and Amex and those groups, but then also, worked within regions for schools and towns and councils. So it really is that burnout, sadly, and stress and well-being and performance and happiness, sort of the antithesis, they all reach across every sector, because we're all feeling it. And like I said, I wrote the burnout epidemic and started writing it pre-pandemic, and in the pandemic, it exploded. But it was a problem leading up to it. It just happened that this crisis sort of exacerbated all those issues. And in every organization, in every individual, we're feeling it right now. And it's still very ever present.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, we're hearing about it from many different sectors as well. And I think, you're so well positioned to help people because, as you mentioned, you've been doing so much of the research even pre-pandemic. So, it was like pre-pandemic, then through the pandemic, and then still leading the conversation kind of post-pandemic. So thank you. I'm gonna, one other questions come in. It's that conundrum of being in the meetings industry and knowing the value of meetings and events, and relates to the nothing meeting that you mentioned. So Dawn is asking, wouldn't the nothing meeting just add to more meeting overload, especially if it's weekly? We're seeing some staff disengage in meetings. So can you speak to that a bit more?
Yes, so you're right. I mean, well-being can't be workload. We're seeing the research that I mentioned that's so fascinating. It's looking at people, particularly people that have a lot of other stuff going on in their work, and they're not hourly, and that they have to kind of, balance that juggle, that they are the ones that are even more stressed. The resiliency programming, some of the other programming that was being tested within this research, they found that those people that, again, that were trying to develop their resiliency, actually it had a negative impact because they couldn't fit it into their schedule. And so we don't want well-being to be workload, but what we want to do is create efficiencies. And so we need to be looking at, meeting fatigue overall. How can we pull some of that fatigue back so that we, around meetings and the time that we're spending at meetings, to focus on some other ways that we can integrate what is actually really foundational to our productivity into that work week. If people are continuing to have no time and space to engage in self-care or any of those kinds of kind of tools for wellness, then we're just constantly in that state of burnout, and we're never going to get out of it. And a lot of what it boils down to is inefficiencies. Looking at the inefficiencies, a great example is Shopify, how they did this huge purge of all of their meetings in a span of 6 to 8 weeks. And they were looking at, okay, what does this actually shift? They wanted to really understand the data around what that would mean. And over 6 to 8 weeks, where they just made their big meetings on certain days, and they had their shorter meetings on other days, and they reduced it into a time scale when they were actually going to have those meetings, they saved 322,000 hours in the course of those 6 weeks. And so there are ways that we can tweak it so that nothing meeting is actually a part of our work week, that it's the most favorite thing that we do. And that's what's missing, because people aren't collaborating as efficiently because they're not friends. We're finding that there's, a loneliness piece which is making people quietly quit, and they're not doing, the work that would fuel them. They don't care about the work. We work faster and more efficiently if we're well. If we don't have time to be focusing on those things, then we just add more hours to the day. It feels very counterintuitive, and it's hard to imagine that, another meeting could actually solve another meeting or meeting fatigue. But It's really about looking at it as an overall goal. And, a lot, and in the, broader talk, I provide like very specific tactics of how we can reduce those inefficiencies, and then how we can make that nothing meeting actually be valuable, how we can track it, how we can measure it. And I think that's where people don't know how to operationalize this, but it's very easy to operationalize so that we can see the benefits, and then we can measure to see how that is actually coming out in performance metrics.
Thank you. Yes, and sometimes the the more you connect or the more meetings, then it gives you that pulse and it gives you that movement forward. Just deal with things, move forward rather than waiting a whole nother week or 2 weeks before you get together and talk about something. So
Yeah,
yes,
and I just want to add there's a thing that's called relational energy. And I write about that in the book. This relational energy, it's contagious, and we see that when we have, that, and it's describing like what I say is like the vibe, like the team mojo. It's called relational energy, and I think that's what we need to start thinking of, is like, where do we get that mojo back? Kind of where do we get those vibes back, where we're working fast, we're working on the same goals, we're connecting, we're meeting targets faster. You only get that if you have cohesion, and you get that through relational energy.
like that. Okay, one last question and then we're going to end. There's a question from Jennifer about the 4-day work week. And this can be challenging in the events industry, but do you think we'll ever see a 4-day work week?
It's really, I love that you're asking that, because it's really growing, and there's a lot of great research. I mean, longitudinal research plus just interventions that Microsoft did, for example, and found that it really works. So they're starting to do that more. We're seeing that we can be equally or even more productive and they looked at this in the research over 3 years. They looked at this and looked at all different roles. They figured, oh, it would only work with certain roles. It would only work in the, knowledge-based economy, where you don't have to be in person. And they actually found that not to be true, that it worked for, accountants as well as it did police officers. I mean, it works across the board. And so more and more organizations are testing it. I think the more that companies adopt it, the more likely that in the event industry, you're going to see that become the norm. We're going to start pushing off those, those events or meetings. You already see that on the bookends, on the Mondays and Fridays. We're seeing kind of a more of a focused attention in those Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when you're looking at corporate events too. I mean, you see still weekends obviously are still there, but it's changing. And that is, the hybrid will lead to, more likelihood of us doing things within that 3-day schedule, which could mean a 4-day work week. And then that will trickle down, but it might be not immediate. We're not going to see that right away within this sector, but I feel like, and I predict that that is going to become more of the norm.
Thank you so much. We could keep going, but we want to respect everyone's time. And I know they've probably got other things starting at the top of the hour too. So thank you again, Jen. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And as we will share this content widely post-event to help everyone within their organizations unlock happiness at work. Thanks, Jen. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.